To order. This is the July 8th meeting of the MARTA Oversight Committee, MARTOC. We haven't had a meeting in a little while. Unfortunately, some members of this committee were occupied through May, and this seemed like an opportune, through May 20th, that is. This seemed like an opportune time to bring everyone back together and cover a few important matters. MARTA, as I believe MARTA just adopted its fiscal year 2015 budget, so we'll be looking for an update on the budget. As we do periodically, we bring we bring Davis Allen back for the Davis Allen Hour, or half hour, or 15 minutes, however long he needs. We always like to hear updates on the transformation initiatives. How did I do? Very good. And then also a couple of other matters that have been in the news of late. The Clayton County Service, which was just approved by the Clayton County Board of Commissioners to go to the ballot for a full penny this past Saturday, as well as the Atlanta Streetcar Service. We'd like to get an update from MARTA staff on how all of that came together or is coming together, as the case may be, from MARTA's standpoint, and in particular with an eye toward any impacts that might be felt by MARTA itself on your side of the equation. Obviously, then you've got a dance partner involved, be it Clayton County or the City of Atlanta. I will say that I certainly view Saturday's vote as a major step forward for transit in the region. It took some getting there, a half penny vote, and then the MARTA board holding the line to bring a new jurisdiction in, potentially, should the voters approve it, under the same terms as Fulton and DeKalb counties. But we did get there. And so certainly would laud MARTA for its efforts in making sure that everybody was kind of operating on the same terms, and in terms of the expansion of the MARTA system and transit in Metro Atlanta, that has got to start somewhere. And I am glad to see that Clayton County is the first county other than Fulton and DeKalb to take the plunge, and hopefully this is the sign of good things to come for MARTA and for transit throughout Metro Atlanta. But what I do want to, and then I'll certainly allow other members to add their remarks as we get to that item on the agenda. But I do want to hear about this primarily from MARTA's perspective, as really the scope of this committee is to deal with MARTA's budget and its management and all of that good stuff. So that being said, why don't we kick it off with the Davis Allen 15 minutes, half hour, whatever you need. I always love hearing about the transportation initiatives, transformation initiatives.
Initiatives that we're actually working toward achieving. The screen now shows all 12 initiatives. The initiatives that are in the blue are the ones that we're currently working on, and it shows that we are meeting our timeline with that, except for one of those five, which is the first one, procurement policies. We got a little hiccup there. We've got people back at the management level still discussing a lot of come up with a comprehensive communication plan. We've done that with Rowland Group. They're in the process now of developing that plan. We want to make sure that we're sending out a consistent message to all of our internal stakeholders as well as our external stakeholders. We want that message to be the same for everyone as to what we're doing with the MARTA transformation initiatives.
Mr. Allen?
Yes, sir.
The graph you showed in the first slide, if you can back up, is a little different than what was originally in the roadmap in terms of the timing of everything, and maybe I'm just misreading it,
Oh, no,
which
sir.
is
Yeah.
always possible.
You're absolutely correct. In the roadmap, they had everything starting at that first quarter, Q1.
Right.
We didn't actually get this program started until that Q3.
Okay.
So we pushed everything forward. We kept the same length of time, but we want to mirror it with the actual time we started this program.
All right, and certainly, and then I guess that, I mean, and what is the additional little block of time added on to procurement policy?
That is
there?
procurement policy enhancement.
Right.
I'm going to address that in a slide when we get to it, but what we're doing there, we are redefining all of our policy and procedure for procurement. We've got it done, but we're sending it around for management review, and that's taking a little longer to get that review process done.
Okay. And I assume we're indicating that revenue enhancement is, and this is certainly something that's understandable, is an ongoing process.
Yes,
right?
sir.
All right.
We're on target with all the other four timelines, the other four initiatives.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Continue.
Now, the procurement enhancement initiative, this is the one that I spoke of. Here, we're trying to come up with a new process and procedural manual. The goal there was to try to reduce our processing time by 25%. We looked at all of our procedures and we revamped a lot. Management is now in the process of reviewing those manuals. Once that process is done, we're going to roll that out for all of the employees to be trained on the new process and procedure for implementing all of our procurements.
And on this slide, Mr. Allen, when you say legislative procurement policy, I assume, are you talking about what the MARTA Act requires, or are you talking about general board policy plus the MARTA Act?
All of the above.
All of it, okay. And I assume then, looking at the second slide, are we generally satisfied with where we are after the most recent MARTA Act revisions? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So you're not anticipating coming back and asking for anything more or different in that regard?
We may come back to ask for some refinement of a couple of items that as we start implementing, that may be necessary, because there's just a few tweaks that may be necessary to clean up a little language here and there, but nothing substantial, I would say,
All right.
on the procurement side.
Okay. In addition to that, we were also successful in getting the board to adopt a consent agenda, which also speed up time on a lot of these procurements. Okay, this next slide is personnel cost efficiency.
How is that being handled? When is the consent agenda being implemented?
It's already implemented.
It's already, so
Yes, sir.
so when did that occur?
Probably, 6 months ago? Yeah. Yeah,
All
longer than
right,
6
and
months.
before that, it was each separate item voted on, or by the board? All right, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, this next section is the personnel cost efficiencies. Under this particular initiative, this is where we get the greatest potential for cost efficiency from a personnel standpoint. Here, each time I've come before you all, we stated that we're looking at our medical and retirement plan. Those two initiatives are under review with our contract negotiation, and we don't want to get into too much of that. We're currently right now in negotiation with ATU on those particular items. This next slide is revenue enhancement, and as you stated, this is ongoing, but this shows all of the various revenues that we're trying to enhance, and we're also adding one new revenue here, is alcohol advertising. We put a pilot program in place for a year to see how that worked, and that program is still in place now. At the end of that period, we will assess if we want to continue with that or add it to the new contract that's going to be out. Also, we're looking at our TODs. We're still looking at real estate. On the real estate, we're looking at any excess properties that will no longer be utilized for transit. We're looking at how and if we can dispose of some of those properties. On the planning, we're looking at concession, and the revenue operation is where we're looking at parking. Those items I just spoke of on the next slide. On the planning, we're looking at concession. We're doing our phase 2 concession. With phase 2 concession, we're looking at food and beverages. Now, phase 1 was beverages and snacks, but if you recall, phase 1 was beverages and snacks from a vending machine. With food and beverages under phase 2, we're looking at really doing a sit-down type restaurant or some carts in our station to do the food and beverages. Under that program, we've already got interest from McDonald's, Subway, and Starbucks, but we're still reviewing that program to see how we really want to go on it.
What stations are being looked at for that?
I'm not sure. Yes.
Effectively, the vendors will tell us which ones they're most interested in.
Okay, so I assume that it would require some building out of something in some station
could,
somewhere, right?
Right. It could be setting aside space at different stations and then the vendors having to accommodate within that space. It could also be that the vendors come to us saying, hey, look, we got a totally different, fresh idea. And we would be willing to listen and look at that as well.
So it would be a function of what space they think they can make work at a profit,
Right.
in essence.
And that does not interfere in a substantive way with our operations.
Right.
And the safety of the system.
All right. Who's 15? Is that Senator Fort?
How would this revenue enhancement, the concessions, coordinate with your policies regarding food and beverages on trains, buses, and I believe that policy has changed recently. Can you tell us about that, please?
We wouldn't change the policy. What we allow now are folks, if you have a beverage, for example, with a closed type top, you can use that. So a person like what the good senator is using next to you, you can use that on the bus or train. And in terms of taking food onto the system, we still wouldn't allow that. You can, well, let me change that. You can bring the food on if you have it in a bag, secured, that sort of thing. But we would not allow, say, the eating of sandwiches on the buses or trains.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
You may.
Do you anticipate issues, increased problems? Because, the reason you don't allow open containers or open food is it damages the infrastructure, particularly of the trains and buses. So does that, you're going to have increased issues with that, aren't you?
We'll have to be more vigilant in making sure people understand the rules. But what we found, even through the Right Respect campaigns, that as they understand the rules, they tend to follow them, thankfully.
Thank you.
Okay, and the second bullet on this slide is the automated parking revenue control. We're in the process of publishing the RFP sometime toward the end of July. We anticipate a notice to proceed in March of 2015. These are just estimated dates. We anticipate implementation to be complete February of 2016. We're also looking at property leases for sale. As I stated earlier, we're looking at properties that are no longer valid for transit operation. We're looking at bringing on a broker to help us analyze those properties. And once that's done, our engineering department must certify that those properties are no longer needed for transit purposes. So we're in the process of doing that also. We want to go back to the board with a list of properties that have been identified. We want to try to do that around September 2014.
On parking, is the objective to begin charging fees where fees are not presently being charged?
No, sir. Right now, we're trying to set up parking at all of our existing parking lot that we currently charge at now. We're just trying to automate it.
Okay, so we're not looking at any new parking fees.
No,
we're just looking at changing the system we're using for existing fees.
We will continue to review that, though, because one of the limitations we have currently is that because of the technology, we are allowing free parking or very low-cost parking at places where we should be charging more, because we don't have controls in some places where people drive to our parking lot, take the train in, and stay for a week. and go to the airport, stay, go wherever they're going, stay for a week and not pay their fair share versus like what they have to do at North Springs or Sandy Springs and others. So as we get the technology and the controls in place, in all likelihood, we will at some point in the future begin to charge the appropriate amount for folks. It still will allow people who use the service on a daily basis to park for free, but for those, in those cases where they're spending the night and that sort of thing, they should be paying.
And I have no problem with that. I guess the only real concern I have is for the daily rider. I mean, if you start to, I mean, by charging a fee where you are not presently charging a fee for a daily rider, you're in essence adding to the fare, which then drives up the cost-benefit calculus in the rider's mind as to whether it's really worth it to hop on a train versus getting in their car.
And that is part of what we have to continue to analyze. One place that's maybe the most complicated situation we have in the system, maybe with the exception of College Park, is that medical center, where if someone goes in for a doctor's appointment, if they're shrewd enough, they use our service, they use our parking area for free, where if they use any other parking area in that area, they pay. So we have to see how we can use technology to make sure that it is our daily rider who's using that service and not just someone who is taking advantage of the situation.
And I'll probably, I think, Ms. Briggins knows that I heard from a couple of constituents who are daily riders about the parking at medical centers. So I would be interested in an update on that. I mean, I certainly have no problem with, if someone is using MARTA's deck in lieu of parking at St. Joseph's Hospital for a fee. I certainly understand that. I just wouldn't want to add to the cost of ridership.
Understood.
That's all. Yeah.
Understood.
Okay, this next slide are just some remaining revenue generating ideas that we're currently looking at. For the most part, all of these are still under review. We've got a couple that we're going to publish an RFP for in September of 2014, the billboard management. But all these other ones are in process of review. But they are, they're not big revenue generating dollars, but we want to look under every stone just to see where there might be a couple of dollars. Okay, now we want to talk about HR and payroll. Of the three initiatives we've already spoke of, those were efficiency initiatives. HR and payroll was an optimization initiative. We've done a lot of work over the past 8-9 months. We've refined all of our requirements. And yesterday, we published the RFP yesterday for HR and payroll. And we're getting a lot of response back from vendors who have pulled down that RFP last night and yesterday afternoon. So HR and payroll is on the street now. Paratransit optimization, we're still doing a lot of work there. We're still developing our requirements. We're looking where we can go out and make changes in our operation to become more efficient. And we're still looking to have an RFP together toward the end of this year. Now,
is that where we were as of the last meeting?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I note the timeline's drawn out a bit from where it was originally.
Right.
It's just a function of the difficulty of putting together the RFP for this one.
That's correct, sir.
And I presume, or I guess I should just flat out ask the question, when I see the word optimization versus outsourcing, which was the KPMG word that was used, where generally we are looking to outsourcing as a solution here still, correct?
Yes, sir.
That has not changed. We're just kind of talking KPMG versus transformation initiatives.
Trying to make it a little easier.
I need to get my own mind right, right?
Right.
Okay. Sounds good. Senator Fort.
Trying to not use privatization, huh? But let me ask you a question about the paratransit. What input has the disabled community had? I know at the last meeting, I believe I asked the question about how the disabled community was giving input, being engaged on this paratransit initiative. Can you tell me how they've been engaged and up to this point and going forward?
Currently, the communication plan I spoke of earlier, that's where we're going to get engaged with all of our external stakeholders and the internal stakeholders. To my knowledge, I don't think we've had any meeting with them yet, but those are in the plan to do that. Now, Rich.
Good afternoon, Rich Krisak. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for MARTA. We have an EDAC committee that has regular scheduled meetings, as you're probably aware. They know of the idea. They know that what the transformation initiative is. They've given us some limited feedback. We will be sure that as the RFP moves forward, that they will be part of the team reviewing the proposals, probably in a non-voting respect, but they'll be engaged and actually as the project moves forward.
Follow up, Mr. Chair. When is that RFP going to hit? I'm sorry, I think you may have already mentioned this. When is the RFP going to hit the street?
The goal is to try to get it out on the street around December, but that's just a target right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Now, this slide, cleaning service optimization. This is the next initiative that we're going to start on, and we're going to start this one probably in the next couple of months. What this says is that we are looking to do an optimization on all of our cleaning function. Currently, we spend about 16.5 to 17 million on cleaning function. That is just personnel costs only. Some of our buildings right now are already done on a contractual basis for cleaning, but we're going to look at our bus operation, rail operation, and some of our facilities to see what we can do to impact the cost that we have right now for cleaning. We want to assess that to see what vendors out there can do for us, if anything, and try to lower that cost that we currently spend on an annual basis today.
Representative Taylor.
And to the GM and Road Marta down here today.
Agreed. That is a heavy cleanup item, and I was hoping the chief was here because she could tell you exactly what our current right. And what we'll do at our next meeting is I'll make sure we come back and give you an update as to what we're doing. Right, and generally we are governed by state law as it reflects to outside control of smoking and so forth. And if there's a legislative fix we may need to bring back, we'll address that as well. But we'll give you an update as to how big we think the problem is and what some potential courses of action are.
And this last slide, the initiative we want to look at here is our workers' compensation cost containment. Here we're trying to come up with a means to get people back to work sooner when they're out on injuries. Currently, we are only allowed 21 slots. And that is a negotiated item under the contract with the union. So we're looking there to see what we can do to improve that, to create additional slots so we can bring people back to work on a temporary basis sooner when they're out on a compensation type injury. And that completes my presentation.
Further questions for Mr. Allen? Seeing none, thank you for the presentation. We'll see you again on this subject in a couple months.
Yes, sir.
All right, next up on the agenda, we have a presentation of MARTA's fiscal year 2015 budget.
Good afternoon. I'm Gordon Hutchinson, MARTA's Chief Financial Officer, and I will be presenting today the two budgets, MARTA's two budgets, the highlights of our fiscal year 15 board-approved operating and capital budgets. And I will start with the operating budget. And the first page is the vision for our future. And this vision is really in three main themes. It's really an employee focus, a customer focus, and a focus on improving the fiscal strength of the agency. And I won't read all of them, but in terms of employee focus, any kind of transportation business that involves people, and particularly rapid transit, is a very people-intensive business. And we want to reestablish MARTA as an employer of choice, to reward people based on actual accomplishments and bring back merit increases for our non-represented employees. Also, reform our health care, not only to reduce costs, but also to really improve the outcomes in terms of the health delivery. And in terms of our customers, we want to both improve the frequency of our service, which we've already done, improve some of our bus route structure, and also, of course, improve the quality of service. A few key things is that we've not had a fare increase in fiscal year 14, and we won't have one in the present fiscal year 15. We also are working hard, and Mr. Parker particularly, around improved public perception of the agency. And then in the fiscal arena, really we are now focused on a balanced budget, having turned in, even though we don't have the official results yet for fiscal year 14, but a surplus in both fiscal year 13 and 14. So we've been able to restore reserves that were actually a few years projected to be on a path to being depleted. And we'll show that to you later on. In terms of the organizational goals that focus really on people and what we do, there's a few key themes around here, around people with accountability and excellence, routine excellence, to improve efficiencies in the way we do things, which will help to strengthen our future financial situation. We have several means that we're pursuing, as Davis has highlighted, increasing revenue, but TOD and developing a model program is a key area of focus. And then in terms of customer service, in addition to just the service that is out there and available to people, we want to use advanced technology, and we've already started to do that through real-time information on next train, next bus, and the Police and Say app, along with improving the signage in the station. The next slide just gives a little bit more color around our customer focus. And one of the highlights here, as I mentioned, is the increased frequency of service, which we've rolled out on our trains, where we've gone down to 10-minute headways, and on the trunk at peak, it's actually trains running north, south, and east, west on the trunk every 5 minutes. The Secret Shopper program is a way of really being able to independently measure and objectively measure what our customers are actually seeing by having experts out in the field to actually ride our system and see what is actually happening. The Ride with Respect campaign is something that's been rolled out, and we believe that to date, since it was rolled out in November, it's been quite successful. And what you will notice in terms of these dates is that everything that was promised by Mr. Parker really over a year ago, we have either already on schedule, or in some cases we're ahead of schedule. We've moved dates up and implemented sooner than what was actually promised. Turning to the next slide is just a few more specifics around employee focus. Some of the things are restoring our bus and rail rodeo, and then employee development initiatives, which will be improved training, focus on career development, and all of those kinds of things that we need to do as an agency to attract, retain, and develop a good workforce. Sorry. The next thing is the fiscal focus, and a few real highlights are that we are now projecting reserves approximately $163 million, and that is $39 million better than what was budgeted as a result of turning in a second surplus year against what had originally been budgeted as a deficit. Yes.
Hold on one second. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is the reserve balance attributed to revenues higher than projected or expenses less than anticipated?
Both.
Do you have an idea of how much for each?
Could give you the split, but I think it's about 15, 20 million on the revenue side, and the balance is on the expense side.
Okay, thank you. I think now I see it.
And
You've got
we've got it
dropped it in a
We've got
forecast.
actually a breakdown
In the next slide, I see
on the
it.
next slide in terms of what it is. I'm not too far off. It's
No,
actually
you-
about 20 million
20 on the
on the
revenue?
revenue side, and and about 18. So it's relatively evenly split between the two.
Would the revenue be attributable to sales tax or to fares?
Sales tax and the ad valorem tax primarily are the two upsides on the revenue. With the increased service and increased quality of service, we're expecting our ridership to increase and our revenue to increase in future years. But MARTA was on about a 6-year decline in our ridership and revenue, and you don't tend to come off of that with a V, you tend to come off of it with a U. So the first thing that we had to do was stabilize it and then really start growing it, and we believe we're now sort of on the cusp of the growth stage. We started to grow it early in the fiscal year 14 fiscal year, but then we had, as you know, the winter storms in both January and February, and a few other things which really flattened off our ridership. But we're optimistic that we are growing right now.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, one more.
You may.
If you could elaborate on where you found the cost savings, that you were able to keep the cost down from projection. Thank you.
The biggest cost item that we have is people and costs that go with people. So it had to do with not filling positions, and if you don't fill those positions, then the benefit and other costs don't come with it. And plus, our benefit costs have been somewhat lower. We've been able to hold the line a bit in terms of the cost increases that had been projected in the budget.
Great. With no reduction in
Yes, Keith.
A couple other items I would mention. The other revenue component where we should have seen more revenue increase was on the fares. But we have foregone 2 different fare increases that would have totaled, I think, 25 cents. It was a 15 and a 10-cent fare increase that had we let those go in, our revenue in all likelihood would have gone up. But we thought that was not the best thing to do for our customers. On the savings side, we flattened the organization a bit, so we removed several deputy-level positions. We eliminated those jobs, and we also have found enormous savings on the IT area. And I think we gave a presentation to you all maybe 6 months ago, a few months ago, about some of those cost-saving initiatives. But a number of different things, and then the revenue has increased a bit on the tax side.
I may want to drill down on the cost savings with regard to IT in particular in a future meeting with
Sure.
a
We
more
actually did
elaborate presentation.
We did a full presentation for the board on that, so we can share that.
All right. Senator Fort?
Yeah. This is a question for the general manager, and because it has something to do with budget, future budgets, future revenue enhancements. It was my position that the streetcar should be operated by MARTA. That is, if you're going to do the streetcar in the city of Atlanta, it ought to be done by the people who have a proven track record, as opposed to a bureaucrat at City Hall who doesn't know anything about transportation. That's my position. It is my understanding at this point, Mr. General Manager, that the streetcar is being operated jointly by MARTA and City Hall, and that at some point in the future, 2 years or so, it will be completely operated by City Hall. and I may be wrong in the time frame and the particulars, but it seems to me that it ought to be that y'all, and it's, the revenue enhancements is not going to bring you 20 or 30 million dollars, but it's going to bring, there are two things. One, it is going to bring you some revenue while you're out looking for this other revenue, and two, it captures a clientele for MARTA that would start writing the other parts of the MARTA system. So can you tell me what happened in this discussion, and why isn't MARTA doing the streetcar as opposed to a City Hall bureaucrat?
We can certainly talk about that now. We do have a presentation coming up.
And
I
I'm
think.
going to be gone.
Okay.
It does have something. It does relate to the issue of revenue enhancement.
If the chairman will allow.
What I'd prefer to do is hold that until the agenda item on the streetcar.
I'm going to be gone by that time, but Mr. General Manager, this is of such a concern to me. I had a transportation town hall meeting in May that dealt just with GDOT and how it's impacting my district. I'll listen to the tape of what you say or don't say when it comes down to that, but I'm going to ask you to come out to my district and talk to us about that, because y'all do it best. You have a
We'll be glad to have that
record.
conversation.
And I want you to come out to my district. I'm sure you're going to be brilliant in your discussion of it. And
Well, is there a specific question that you want answered here and now?
I just want to know what happened. I know there were negotiations back and forth between City Hall. The mayor had his position, and I assume that y'all were arguing for MARTA to do soup to nuts on the operation of it. And I just want to know what happened and what kind. I just recoil at the notion of City Hall running a transportation system.
Well, the 30-second answer to that would be, when the grant was put together, it was always a city project. MARTA needed to make the official application for the grant, because we at the time were the only designated grantee who could have made such an application. But it is now, once the project was granted, the asset is completely owned by the city.
Absolutely.
So as the owner of the city, as the owner of the asset, the city also made application to become a designated recipient of federal funds, and they have received that designation. So it, from my understanding, has always been their intention at some point to be in the position to operate the system themselves. The current agreement calls for MARTA to provide a level of management oversight, and ultimately, but ultimately, as you correctly stated, that the city would take over those operations. From a revenue standpoint, just to touch on that piece, because you mentioned that, we would make money off of it. I mean, it's not enough revenue. It's a relatively small operation, so it's not something we make money off of. However, we want the project to be extremely successful, because it will draw new people who otherwise don't use transit. And we want to capture those folks, so we do have a seamless fare system. We'll work with the city, even when we are outside of the operating arm of the service, to make sure that the citizens have a great overall high-quality customer ride. So a person taking a bus off the Cobb system, transferring to a MARTA train, and ultimately transferring to a city streetcar would have a great seamless ride throughout that entire experience. So that would be our goal.
The only follow-up I would give for that is this, is we're asking you to optimize, become cost-efficient, and all those things. And it seems to me that we have an opportunity to optimize and make efficient another transportation system. Y'all probably can do it better than folk, on the second floor over at City Hall. That's just my opinion. People can differ, but it seems to me if we're going to make you optimize, try to force you to be more efficient or privatize or whatever, then it ought to be done across the board. Thank you. I appreciate you, Mr. Chair, giving me that leeway.
Senator Miller.
I would just like to express, to go on record with Senator Fort, we don't agree on much, but we agree on this.
What's going to happen?
Watch out.
Clearly, we have the wrong Senator Miller in this meeting today. Where's the other one? Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Senator Miller. Going back to you had mentioned previously that the system saw some additional revenue out of the title ad valorem tax, right, which is in essence the sales tax that's now charged on motor vehicles when we equalized it for the local governments, correct?
Correct, yes.
So in terms in whole dollars, what's because you're now receiving kind of a stream of income that you would not have received before, because before we were charging a straight up ad valorem tax on motor vehicles, and we still are to the extent that the vehicle was purchased before a certain time. But with new motor vehicle purchases now, and by the way, I know a fine dealer who wouldn't be charging up in Gainesville, wouldn't be charging any TAVT that would benefit MARTA, but he's still a fine dealer, nevertheless. In terms, what is MARTA receiving from the TAVT?
For the TAVT, we're forecast in fiscal year.
There it is.
In fiscal year 14, about 18 million, but we see that dropping fairly significantly in the fiscal year 15 and other years. And the reason is part of it was there was a one-time opt-in, which gave us, a bump, and also the way that tax is structured, which we will actually be probably coming back to you to talk about once we've done more research and analysis, is that MARTA drops as a residual, and the model that has been done by University of Georgia shows that residual for MARTA is going to dry up largely, unless the total tax that gets collected is higher than they're anticipating. So it's an issue for us because we used to participate in the sales tax on the portion related to the dealer sales. But of course that has now all been rolled into the ad valorem. So we've gotten a very favorable result in fiscal year 2014, but we don't actually see that continuing into future years.
Is that a net, so what, with the replacement of the sales tax by the TAVT?
It'll be a net loss of revenue in fiscal year 15 and future years, particularly fiscal year 16 and out years. What has been happening is that the ad valorem tax, the total receipts have been running higher than the University of Georgia model predicted. And that's not surprising because on the sales tax side, Georgia Tech has been modeling that for years. So they've got a lot of history and they've been tweaking and refining that model on sales tax. And so it really is pretty accurate. So we'll need another year or so probably with the ad valorem to really get a better future outlook. But what the model is showing right now is that our ad valorem tax will really go to nothing or virtually nothing in 16 and out years. So it'll be a net loss of revenue.
I'm not understanding why it would be a net loss. Let Representative Riley ask a question.
As a follow-up on that, I know that the local governments were being held harmless with the legislation, and they'll be compensated. Is MARTA not eligible for that same consideration?
They are not. That's the issue.
That's the problem.
That's the issue. The counties are being made whole.
Right, and the cities as well.
But MARTA is not, because it's kind of a waterfall, and so MARTA participates as a residual. And if there's no residual, then we won't participate.
So then that will be a shortfall in the sales tax side going forward. Okay.
That's exactly right.
I hope that's helpful, Mr. Chairman.
And is it by virtue of the formula that there is no residual?
Well,
I mean, what?
Can you answer that part first?
Well, I mean, it's a virtue of the fact that the state is now taking a fixed percentage in the schedule. And so when you calculate, as the University of Georgia model has done, calculate expected total receipts, you take the state's guarantee, and then you go and calculate the make-whole for the counties, then calculate a residual. They are right now calculating that there won't be a residual or a very small residual in 16 and future years, which is it's a real issue for MARTA.
Well, I think it bears looking at allowing MARTA to participate in the same make-whole that the counties are participating in.
We agree, and that's one of the
Well, I'm glad we're all on the same page.
well, and that is one of the areas that we will be coming back for a legislative fix on, because I think this was you never know, but we think it was an unintended consequence.
So there was an initial windfall, but because you're not participating on the same footing as the counties with their SPLOS and whatnot, it's just the way, right?
Right, it'll be a net loss for us over time.
Okay, all right. I mean, not all right, but we do need to have that conversation, yes.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you.
Senator Miller.
Can we also acknowledge one point on that formula? And I think as we move forward on the TAVT, it bears looking at the formula itself and how it relates to different segments of the automobile industry. If you're familiar, if you get down in the weeds of that bill, there are some gross inequities, and that would negatively impact MARTA's potential revenue stream, the state's potential revenue stream, and the local government's potential revenue stream with relation to discounts on the fee itself. And if you're not familiar with that, I can tell you about it in detail, but and then there's one other issue, and it escapes me at the moment, that is a gross inequity as well that will create a situation where the revenues will flatten or even decrease in the future. So.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is a complicated issue. I mean, you deal with the, well,
Yes.
you have to deal with the.
We made it complicated. It was very simple.
With the structural issues among, among dealers in the bill itself, but then you also have kind of with regard to local governments, the fact that really the equalization payment is meant to replace a loss of property tax revenue for the counties, but by the same token, the loss of sales tax revenue, because you're replacing a sales tax with the title ad valorem tax, in essence, really shouldn't negatively impact MARTA, and that's, an additional layer of complication to what Senator Miller is talking about, and then what we were trying to equalize with the legislation that passed. So it's definitely a conversation that needs to be had, and I'm certainly open to having it between now and the legislative session.
I agree and appreciate that.
All right.
Okay, on the fiscal focus, a lot of our initiatives around fair revenue, we're trying to strike a balance to try to grow fair revenue without, reducing ridership. And then turning to the next page, where it has titled Projected Financial Plan. What you can see here, as I made reference to before in 2013, the budget that the MARTA board had passed was that was to be a loss year and a reduction of reserves. It proved to be a surplus year. The budget for 2014 was expected to have a further decline of reserves of over 28 million. We're now expecting about a 10 million surplus. I mean, that number won't be official until our audit's complete, and that will take some time. But that's our sort of our best estimate right now. And based on increasing reserves to about 162, 163 million, we believe that our reserve levels are adequate. The MARTA Act, the legislation requires statutory reserves of just over 40 million because it's based on a percentage of the prior year's revenue. We think that 162 is good. We may actually manage it down because obviously, as you know, carrying money gives you virtually a no investment return. But we right now are somewhat concerned about timing around federal receipts with the trust fund. So we want to keep an adequate level of cash. We do review, though, the statutory requirements would be a bare minimum, because to get below that would really be without having an operating line in place, and right now we don't. We're looking at maybe putting one in. Without having that in place, you're really sort of knocking on the door of insolvency for the agency. So we always try to manage those reserves well above what the statute requires us to keep as a minimum. And the future years, 15 and 16, if you see the impact on reserves line, it's relatively flat. And the reason is with adequate reserves, we're not in the business of running continuous surpluses. We want to reinvest in the business, and that's what we're doing, because if our reserves are adequate, if we can keep a balanced budget out in the future, that really is the target of the agency. Then if we look at this next slide, what this slide illustrates is the last budget and the 5-year lookout that was passed by the board prior to Mr. Parker arriving showed a 5-year path of reserve depletion, and of course this is what was called the fiscal cliff of MARTA, and that's that red line. The green line shows what we expected in the 5-year plan and the fiscal year 14 budget passed by the MARTA board just over a year ago, and this top line now just graphically illustrates where we expect to be based on the budget passed by the MARTA board a couple of months ago. But if we look at this next slide, we absolutely do have fiscal challenges, because when you improve and increase the frequency of service and roll out other programs, it costs money, and you have to do those before your ridership builds. There's always a lag between increasing your service and having the ridership and the revenue follow with it. Also, we do face increased costs from regulatory and compliance mandates, some of them coming from various arms of the federal government. But we do have opportunities that I won't touch in a lot of detail because Davis has already discussed them, including we do have some congestion mitigation air quality funding, which partially funds, not nearly in whole, but partially funds some of our increased service, and it has also partially funded a few additional natural gas buses. So turning from there, I'd like to discuss the capital budget, because MARTA's capital budget is, along with its debt service, is of the same magnitude as our operating budget. It's quite large because it is a capital-intensive business, and assets on the system are starting to age out now that some of them have been in place for 30-plus years. And our approach really to what we fund within the limits of our affordability, within the limits of sound fiscal principles, are, first of all, projects that are under contract or in very late stages of the procurement process. We fund those and move them ahead. We also have a project scoring prioritization technique. It's a software program called Expert Choice, which puts a little bit more science and a little bit more objectivity into the process. And then, of course, we really have to fund life safety critical projects and operations critical projects. Even though the budget has been expanding under the prior administration, there was a fair bit of deferred maintenance, deferred capital expenditures, and so there really is not a lot of discretionary spend in our capital budget. Once you get through the things that you have to do and have to complete, there's not a lot of money left over. And the next slide, which I won't go into detail, but what this is showing here is this is just simply showing what our source of funds is. And sales tax is our biggest single source of funds, followed by federal funds. This agency has taken on a lot of debt in the past, over $1.8 billion, and so really debt issuance is not much of a source of funds for this agency because most of what we're doing is simply rolling over and we're funding the debt service payments, including interest. And we are, as an agency, going to be very cautious in terms of taking on much more debt. We want to see the sales tax grow to be able to support more debt because the agency does not want to lever itself beyond what has already taken place in the past. We are relatively highly levered, and if you look at what's happened in the previous 5 years, I know there was a recession, but before Mr. Parker arrived, the agency unfortunately increased its debt load when its net capital assets were actually declining, and those are not sustainable trends. And we've certainly started to reinvest in our asset base, and we really want to try to hold the line on debt. This next slide here just is, we've adopted, in terms of looking at all of our assets, the FTA methodology of categorizing our assets between sort of vehicles and rolling stock, our facilities and station, our maintenance away, which is our track and fixed infrastructure systems like IT and rail control and other systems, and then other sort of what we call non-assets that are being funded. They're not, in accounting terms, actual assets recorded on the books. And then if we look at the budget by program, again, I won't get into a lot of detail, but you can see that vehicles, which include buses, rail cars, are a big chunk of our expenditures. Systems, including rail control systems, IT systems, are very large as well. And then, maintenance away is not that large because, our track infrastructure is in pretty good shape, but again, it's aging out and does need continual capital funds to keep it in a good state of repair. And then facilities and stations are another large area of expenditure. What this does here, this next slide, capital budget top 10 projects, is just gives you a feel of where we're spending our money. The mobility facility, the new facility for paratransit, is the largest one on here. The bus replacement, and the reason that bus replacement is so high is because MARTA wasn't replacing buses for a number of years on its regular cycle, so we ended up with a lot of buses that were beyond their normal useful life, which means that you got vehicles that are less efficient, have higher maintenance costs, and they're less reliable. And so we've had an accelerated 3-year program to bring MARTA from one of the oldest fleets, oldest average age of fleet in terms of years and vehicle miles of any of the major transit agencies in the U.S. to being at least average and probably somewhat above average in terms of the age and condition of our fleet.
Representative Riley.
I think you were at the end of your presentation,
Yes.
and I just
Yes.
wanted to clarify that if the federal government is not forthcoming with the $418 million of capital funds that you've got projected through FY24, you'll be reforecasting your capital plan?
Well, if we're flipping back, the federal funds, you're reading in terms of a 10-year?
Correct.
Our advisors and our intelligence is that we don't believe that there will be a large permanent reduction, but we think there could be a real risk of temporary timing in terms of the funding. But if there is a permanent reduction, then we're going to have to do a rethink on this, absolutely.
Do the numbers that you have here before us reflect a anticipated reduction or anticipate funding on status quo?
This is a status quo because we would have no means of knowing what if there is a permanent reduction in this, MARTA and all of the major transit agencies in the U.S., including ones that are much older than us and have even higher capital requirements than we do, are going to be in a lot of difficulty.
Thank you. I think that's good information for us to be aware of when we have conversations with our federal elected
Right.
officials.
And then the last point here is that these top 10 projects represent roughly half of our fiscal year 15 budget. And then if we look at the next 10, then the top 20 will consume about 64%. So MARTA's got a lot of small projects, but the top 20 big ones consume close to 2/3 of our total funds. And so that concludes my presentation.
Any further questions on the FY15 budget? Seeing none, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Next up, we have presentations on the Clayton County and Atlanta streetcar, Clayton County's approval of the penny sales tax for referendum and how that plays into MARTA with respect to the contract especially. And then the Atlanta streetcar project as well. So,
good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth O'Neill. I'm Chief Counsel at MARTA, and as the Chairman said, I'm just going to go through a brief review of where we stand with Clayton County at this point. As you know, the initial steps on the road to Clayton began with the state legislation, HB 265 and 1009, which lifted the sales tax cap for a county who would join the metropolitan system of transit before the November 1st, 2016 date. So once that legislation was passed, Clayton and MARTA began to negotiate the terms of a rapid transit contract. Both the MARTA board and the Clayton commissioners approved a rapid transit contract which called for the levy of the full 1 penny sales tax last week. The next step in the process is for the Clayton commissioners, or at the time they approved that contract, they also called for a binding referendum by the voters, which under the terms of the MARTA Act, that call had to be made 120 days before Election Day. The next step is for the voters of Clayton County to actually vote on the contract in the November referendum, and then subsequent, if there is a approval vote, then there would be the jurisdictional concurrence from those 3 jurisdictions, Fulton and DeKalb counties and the city of Atlanta, that would permit Clayton to join into the existing rapid transit contract and assistance agreement. The terms, the broad terms of the contract that was negotiated and approved regarding Clayton is that the sales tax would begin on March 1st, of 2015, and that is pursuant to the terms of the MARTA Act. Around that date, the MARTA would begin 1 or 2 bus routes. It would an extension report was incorporated into the contract that was adopted. It's envisioned that probably the first routes will actually be continuation of MARTA routes serving Fulton, DeKalb counties, continuing on into Clayton County. Around July of 2015, the plan is that MARTA would begin limited bus service in Clayton County, with July 16 being the target date for full bus service. And then during this period, there would be a study of a high-capacity transit service, either the commuter rail options or another transit alternative.
Does the contract, how specific is the contract with regard to, and by the way, I do want to request a copy of the contract. I've not seen it. So if you can get that to me, I'd appreciate it, and I'll certainly distribute it to members of the committee.
Yes, sir.
Does the contract spell out what the service looks like, or is it more non-specific in that regard?
There are general outlines of routes. It's really the, as I mentioned, I think there's an extension report that is incorporated by reference into the contract, and that is a plan that was developed that sets out the major corridors and routes. That will still, obviously, if the referendum passes, there'll be a public hearing process to get further input from the citizens of Clayton County as to refinements of those routes, but broad outlines are included in that report.
Was the extension report developed by MARTA or by Clayton County?
Right, and very importantly, in fact, Clayton County had already had under contract a service by a vendor to look at implementing bus service and potential rail service in Clayton County. Our staff largely included that as the framework of how we developed it. So it really is Clayton's service that we are talking about here. And as Liz mentioned, we'll further refine that with the Clayton County staff and commissioners, and then, very importantly, go out to the public and let them make the final decisions, if you will, about exactly where bus routes run and what streets we use and that sort of thing.
Which is the case with routes anywhere.
That's
anyway.
correct. That's correct. But it's largely their plan, which we use as a framework.
There also in the press there were references by Mr. Ash to, in essence, or for lack of a better term, a lockbox that would kind of benefit Clayton County in terms of how the revenue that its sales tax generates would be basically set aside. What can you explain that?
Sure. I'll let Liz get back.
That is one of the terms in the contract, that the half penny, so the bus service that has been developed in these plans really calls for the expenditure of 1/2 of the full penny. So the funds that are generated by the remaining half penny, the agreement calls for those funds during the time that the commuter rail or other high-capacity transit option is being studied and which alternative is going to be built, that during that time, that extra half penny will go into what is a separate account. It's been called a reserve account or an escrow account, but essentially the money all has to flow through MARTA's trustee pursuant to the terms of the MARTA Act and then go into a general fund. Well, a portion that's equal to that additional half penny will then be placed in this account to build out the high-capacity transit option for Clayton.
Right, and how likely is a high capacity? I mean, this is not to. I mean, look, I view the expansion of MARTA into Clayton County as a very positive thing. This is a step that needs to occur, and I think you'll find widespread agreement in the legislature, regardless of where we're from, on that point. I guess the real question is, and this is a question that anybody asks about any rail project anywhere. I mean, you know, I get it, right now there's a study ongoing about the North Line, which is what I mainly hear about given where I come from. And one question that comes up over and over again is how realistic is it that we'll even see the North Line anytime in our lifetimes. The same question can be asked really of any high capacity rail type project. I mean, how realistic is rail for Clayton County with the remaining portion of this penny sales tax?
Well, one of the things about adding a new system is we get a fresh look at the new revenue. And part of what we've developed is looking at what would be a necessary level of bus service and then seeing how much money was left over to implement a high-capacity transit option. So what we presented to Clayton County was one option at around the $270 million mark, another at around $350 million or so, and then developed a debt plan and overall capital plan that could see those two come to fruition. Both of those could be rail or some other high-capacity transit option.
Right. So we're not necessarily talking about rail.
It doesn't have to be, but that would be mutually agreed upon by Clayton and MARTA. So what you're seeing around the country are groups who are if you go to Austin, Texas, they've developed a new commuter rail, 30-mile commuter rail line using these state-of-the-art, great-looking trains that's going pretty well. And then you see that in a few other places like Denton, Texas. But also you're seeing tremendously nice-looking and high-quality bus rapid transit options. So what we want to present are a number of different alternatives, and then let the citizens and the Clayton folks decide which one works best for them.
All right. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, I want to apologize for myself and Representative Geisinger's tardy arrival. We were with a group of North Fulton economic development professionals who all want to extend their appreciation for all of the efforts you all made last week to get a meeting of the minds. They were all very appreciative. We actually had your board member, Frida Hardage, with us, and we all offered her our sincere appreciation that the minds were able to meet during a holiday weekend and move forward. So my appreciation on their behalf and for all the work, and it looks like it's going to be moving forward to a referendum in November. The question I have on the previous slide that Ms. O'Neill had up, number 5 said jurisdictional concurrence. Would the other jurisdictions have to agree to whatever forms of service are offered in Clayton County, as well as this Locks Box proposal, before going forward?
Well, no, let's answer that.
The terms, essentially what the concurrence is to adopt or to incorporate the Clayton County rapid transit contract into the larger rapid transit contracts and assistance agreements. So in essence, yes, they would be agreeing to the terms that are in the Clayton rapid transit contract.
And those terms would include this potential set aside of the halfpenny collection for future whatever assets in Clayton County or service in Clayton County.
That would be part of the contract.
Okay, so 2 out of 3 of the jurisdictions would have to agree to that set aside.
Yes.
Before this could move forward.
It would be at some point after the referendum. Quite frankly, there's a gray area there as to exactly when it has to happen. But as we go forward, yes, we would seek jurisdictional concurrence.
And that would be before the actual collection of the penny sales tax from the...
That cannot be, I'm sorry.
Before you could collect a penny from the Clayton County taxpayers, the jurisdictional concurrence would have to have happened.
We would seek it, yes, after the referendum, but before that March date when the tax can begin being collected, yes.
Okay, thank you. I think the folks in Fulton and DeKalb will be interested in having that conversation about set-asides. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I'll also say, I mean, I certainly understand. I don't, I'll be interested in watching that process play itself out. I mean, I certainly understand that you were engaged in a negotiation with the Clayton County Commission, and there are 2 parties to that, really. There's MARTA, and then there's the Clayton County Commission. I mean, I certainly view it as important that Clayton County come into the system on the same terms that Fulton and DeKalb taxpayers have been participating in the system for all of these years. But there's a give and take between the 2 agencies here, Clayton County and MARTA, as to how you get there. This lockbox or set aside or whatever you want to call it of the halfpenny is presently part of the deal. I don't want to prejudge what the existing MARTA jurisdictions ought to think about that. I certainly understand that this is a negotiated deal, and I'm glad that we got to a point of agreement with Clayton County. So I want to put that on the record.
Well, and I think that the commitment to have the full penny tax was certainly something that our board and MARTA were committed to.
I think you'll find universal agreement on that point here as well. So, continue. Or are
Actually,
we?
that's it.
We're done.
We're
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I would just request, I don't know if there are any further questions on the Clayton County contract from members of the committee. I do see one, so. Or a statement?
On the Clinton County contract.
I would just ask that we get a copy, that the committee be provided a copy of the contract so that we can review it, and that'll be all at this time. Representative Taylor.
Just want to congratulate you on a couple of things. The see something, say something campaign. Having lived all over the world and been an intelligence officer, that is a great thing because I think Americans are not typically used to being that aware or reporting something if they see something out of order. I think that's great. You know, as we've seen today, it's probably why the chief is not here. You know, transit is a high-density target for terrorists, and I think making it awareness, just pushing it out there is a good thing. And having the rider is your best. You know, the rider going to the police officer, the rider hitting your app and saying something ain't right here is the best thing. The other one is with GM Parker. Just was glad to about 6 weeks ago we broke ground on the State Farm site in Dunwoody with the governor. That's a transit development thing that is going to be immediately, probably, I shouldn't say immediately, but in the near future, 3,000 jobs, but a potential 8,000 jobs coming to my district with transit development, and that's just a testament to the investment that's going up around those areas. You know, at the end of the day, just to show you the impact in my district, in particular, the city of Dunwoody, 50,000 people lay their heads down every night there and live there. We have 130,000 people who work there every day, and that's just a great thing. I think they're just super, and they paid a premium for that site. State Farm did.
Before we leave Clayton County as well, I do want to recognize, I see in the audience a former member of the State House, Roberta Abdul Salam, if you just stand up, and congratulations to you on all of your work on bringing MARTA to Clayton County. Mr. Krisak.
Okay. Again, my name is Rich Krisak. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for MARTA, and I'm the executive sponsor for the Atlanta streetcar in terms of our commitment to delivering the project. Some of this you've already kind of hit on with your questions that Senator Fort was asking, but just to kind of reiterate again, this is a city project. MARTA is basically acting as an agent to deliver the project. There are three major funders to this project. MARTA is not one of them. It's the federal government, which to the tune of $47.5 million through a Tiger II grant, the City of Atlanta, and the Downtown Investment District. So MARTA has no money in the capital delivery of the program. And in the future operation of the program, in terms of budget impact, which is one of the things you were talking about, there's really no significant budget impact because, again, we don't finance the operation just as well as we don't finance the capital. So the operating side is, again, got the three same major funders. The Federal Transit Administration is going to award a CMAQ grant to fund the first 3 years or so of streetcar operation. The Downtown Investment District has a piece that they're funding, and then the City of Atlanta. So there's no funding commitment either in the capital or in the operating side of the project for MARTA. Now, there are in-kind services that we have provided because we've done all the procurement work for them. We've done considerable legal work for the streetcar. We've done operating side work out of my group. So we have helped move the project along without a doubt. But we are governed by an intergovernmental agreement that covers the construction piece of it, which actually firewalls and protects MARTA in fact of any cost overruns that would be incurred because of construction of the project.
And on the operating side, we know that there will be no costs incurred by MARTA for 3 years, correct? Based upon what you just said, or does the agreement go further than that?
It goes further. We have no commitment to fund the operation of the streetcar. There's no agreement to do that. So we're an independent agent, basically. In terms of the questions about who operates the streetcar, ultimately that is the federal government. The federal government, FTA, along with the state, because the state has safety oversight. The FTA delegates safety oversight for rail service to the state. That's done through GDOT, through Carol Comer and the Intermodal Division. They ultimately, the state and the FTA, will decide who will actually operate the streetcar. Obviously, the city would like to influence that decision. There's other folks who would like to influence that decision, but ultimately that's got to come from the federal government. So there's the master IGA, which was developed to construct the system, identifies an operating IGA that has to be developed before the system goes into operation. So that's something we're working on diligently now with the project partners, as well as the FTA and the states involved as well, in terms of how that eventually turns out, specifically how that occurs. Okay, so in general, it's a $98 million project. 47.5 of that is contributed by the federal government. It's the largest streetcar grant through the Tiger program that's been awarded to any city. It's a $98 million budget. We are currently on target in terms of cost. Within the $98 million budget, I think there's some confusion about what all that includes, but we wrapped a number of projects into that budget to get projects delivered quicker and to have a larger, more attractive package for a contractor to come after. We did this through a design build process. So we awarded a contract to URS to actually perform the services. A big part of the budget is related to water utilities work, relocation of utilities, as well as the purchase of vehicles and other components of the streetcar. So one of the unique delivery methods we were able to use is the streetcars are actually come from a piggyback order from Utah. So we didn't have to go out and procure separately, competitively, streetcars. We were able to actually package that with a deal with Salt Lake. The substations that power the system are also a piggyback we're able to do with Salt Lake through another federal procurement. And then the track work, most of the track work used to build the system comes from piggyback procurement through MARTA, because the rail is basically the same rail we use in our own system. So there were a lot of unique aspects that really cut down the delivery time and saved considerable money to the city and the project partners and the way we package things. So just simply, it's about a 2.5 mile system. It has 12 stations. We'll look at the next slide to kind of show you an idea of what it looks like. It's basically a loop system. On your right side is the National Historic Site, King Center. Ebenezer Baptist Church is right along the side of the alignment. And then as you go to the left side of the slide, you wind up over at Centennial, right across the street from Centennial Olympic Park. So you hit a lot of major tourist destinations, a lot of hotels, and importantly to us is the interface with us at Peachtree Center Station. So there'll be a direct coordination, direct access. There's a station platform right in front of our south entrance as you come up out of our station. We will be using the BREE system. That's another technology that we're leveraging. It's another federal asset that we're leveraging for the project, although the fare table for the streetcar will not be identical to the MARTA fare structure. However, if you originate your trip on the streetcar and you want to come on the MARTA system, you're going to have to pay an upcharge because obviously we're not going to let you ride for a reduced fare because you started on the streetcar. All that will be covered under a reciprocal agreement, fare agreement, which we have with our other partners like Cobb County, Greta and Gwinnett. So the city will have their own reciprocal agreement which will recover back office costs, because it's not just the machine you see on the street. There's a lot of back office costs with administering the program. They're going to have to pay an equal share of that, just like our other partners do. So that's 12 stations. The stations are very simplistic. It's not fancy. It's pretty cost effective. A lot of it's basically emphasizes the last mile connection that they talk about. So it's a lot of short trip length on and off to get to a pretty short distance to kind of, from our perspective, from MARTA, it kind of extends our reach out from our large fixed skyway system to a more local circulators. And just some general pictures to show you the progress. The system is essentially complete at this point. We're waiting for URS to give us what they call a notice of substantial completion. Once they give us that notice, we have 14 days to accept or reject substantial completion and to add any items that have not, we feel have not been completed to our contract requirements. And then we go into the testing and commissioning phase, which is also MARTA's responsibility. So all the system components will be tested, the vehicles will be tested. We'll go out there in the evening using Atlanta Police to support us to do a lot of the commissioning, testing, training components as we move forward. So this is the one of the vehicles in front of the vehicle maintenance facility, which is right under the freeway connector. This is inside of the maintenance facility. It's a very compact facility. It's very efficient, very low cost. I think it'll work quite well for the streetcar. Again, we only have 4 cars, so it's not a major fleet size. This gives you an idea of the vehicles. These are built by Siemens in Sacramento, California, It's a very proven design. There's hundreds of these vehicles that are in operation across the U.S. right now. This gives you another kind of overhead view of the track work and the overhead contact system, which actually powers the streetcar. Some more construction around the VMF site. This gives you an idea of a very basic shelter station. There'll be ticket vending machines at all these stations that are identical to the MARTA Breeze vending machines, but with a different fare table programmed. The city ultimately will determine the revenue service start date. That's really in negotiations with the FTA. They'll determine what date will start. That's really not under MARTA's direct control. So that is something that the city has got to set for us. So basically the project has come along well. We did suffer a delay. We suffered about a 5-month delay. About 3 months of that was utility relocation, related to utility relocation work, because we're constructing in some of the oldest parts of the city of Atlanta. So even though we do very, very extensive utility research and finding, it's never exactly where you think it's going to be once you start opening up the street. So there was a lot of that went on. We had about a good month of delay because of the January, February winter weather. Really had a major impact on the streetcar. And there were some other kind of related contractor delays. So around 5 months or so behind where we thought we were going to be.
All right, so to recap, MARTA is engaged in substantial capital support at this point in terms of putting the assets on the ground, not in terms of actual capital funding from MARTA. Yeah. We don't know who will be operating because that's the federal government is in the driver's seat there, so to speak. But in any event, that if MARTA were to be engaged in that side of it, it would be at MARTA's budget would not take a hit as a result.
That's correct.
Okay. Representative Geisinger.
Is my understanding correct that the propulsion systems on these streetcars were built in Forsyth County at the Siemens plant?
That's correct. They were. That's a good point. I failed to mention that.
At least there's partially Georgia built.
That's right.
And that draws a question from Representative Riley.
No, actually, a different question. Where is the vehicle maintenance facility for the streetcar?
It's between Edgewood and Auburn off of Ford Street.
So right on the system.
It's right, yeah, right on the system.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
All right. Any further questions for Mr. Krisak? Seeing none, thank you for the presentation today. All right. Well, that concludes our agenda. Anything further from members of the committee? Seeing none, I'll go ahead and close off discussion then. I do want to, and I'll chat with Mr. Parker right after the conclusion of the meeting, but I do want to set another meeting relatively soon, late July, early August at the latest. On that agenda, I will be looking for a presentation on the Medicaid dumping issue with regard to paratransit. I know that is something that we have discussed in the past and something we've kind of held or put on hold pending the resolution of other legislative matters. All of that being resolved at this point, I think now would be a good time to put something new on the legislature's agenda with regard to MARTA, and so I'd like to do a deep dive on that particular issue in the next meeting. I don't know whether it'll be the next meeting or a meeting thereafter, but I would like to see the presentation on the IT cost savings. In essence, the same presentation you did for the board before. I think it would be an interesting presentation for this committee. And then finally, I am going to call on Greta to do a presentation. I see Mr. Markham over there. Call on Greta to do a presentation, maybe jointly with ARC, on the Atlanta Transit website that was just that's still a work in progress, but is up and running. Like to see how that all came together and do a presentation on that for this committee at our next meeting. So there being nothing further to come before the committee, this meeting is adjourned.